Well, for the last 5 weeks now, we've been talking about raising G-rated kids in an X-rated world. And if there's one thing we've learned, that's not an easy thing to do, is it? It's really not easy to do. And perhaps that sometimes as Christians, I think maybe we've made being parents even harder than it needs to be in some ways. I mean, there's this whole, what I would call this Christian parenting industry out there. People who write books and put on seminars, and they try to almost guilt Christians into think that there's just the right way of raising our kids, and that somehow if we don't do it just right, if we mess it up at all, that we're going to ruin our kids for life. Ever felt like that? Here, let me just demonstrate to you. This week I decided I would just Google the term Christian potty training, just for the fun of it. You know how many hits I got? Almost 500,000 hits. There are books written out there by these Christian parenting experts that explain just the right way to train your children to use the toilet. And they almost make the point that if somehow if you mess that up, if you don't train them just the right way, that your kids are going to be ruined for life. Now, I don't know about you. I've looked through the Scriptures. I can't find anything about potty training in the Bible anywhere. But there are a lot of things in the Bible that we can learn. We've been looking at some of those things. And I think what happens sometimes, these Christian parenting experts, what they do is they make parenting, on one hand, they make it much more complicated than it needs to be. And at the other end of the spectrum, I think they also make it much more superficial than it ought to be, because they only deal with kind of the outside things rather than dealing, as we've seen, with the heart of our children. So this morning we're going to take a look at a verse that I think has probably made more Christian parents feel guilty than almost any other verse in the Scriptures. And what I want to attempt to do this morning is to show us that if we'll look at that verse properly in its right context, that actually it shouldn't make us feel guilty, but what it does do is it reveals to us what our children's greatest need is. Now, I've given you some space on your sermon outline to write down your answer to this question. What is a child's greatest need? Now, here's what I want you to do. Just write down the first thing that comes into your mind. Don't make it the spiritual answer. Don't try to put down what you think I'm looking for. Just write something down. What do you think is a child's greatest need? Okay, love. All right. What else? Protection, security. Certainly that's important. Absolutely. What else? What's that? Okay, boundaries. Absolutely. We've talked about that. That's good. That's very good. Yeah, you know, our kids, they need a lot of those things, don't they? They need protection. They need boundaries. They need security. They need love. But what we're going to see this morning is there's something even more important than all those other things. And it's really summed up by this fifth of the 5 Ds that we've been looking at in this series. We're going to talk about how we need to disciple our children this morning. And we're going to come back a little bit later and we're going to answer that question once we've had a chance to look at some Bible verses and see if we can't determine what is it really that our child's greatest need is. As I was preparing the message this week, I began to think, man, maybe this should have been the first message in the series rather than the last one. Because really what I hope to do today is to show you what is the goal of raising our children. What are we really trying to do as we raise up our children? But as I thought about it some more, I thought, you know, it's probably okay that this is at the end too, because we tend to remember the last thing that we heard a little bit more maybe sometimes than the first thing. And so this is probably a good thing for us to leave this series on this note, to begin to understand what our child's greatest need is and what the goal is as parents and as a church as we raise up children. So we're going to begin this morning with the verse that I referred to earlier, the one that I think has probably made more parents feel guilty than almost any other verse in the Bible. It's found in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6. Most of you are probably familiar with this. If you're a Christian parent, I can almost guarantee you're familiar with this verse. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, how many of you are familiar with that verse? How many have heard that one before? Pretty much everyone. How many of you has that verse made feel guilty before? Probably some of you, right? Absolutely. You know why? Because we read that verse, and here's how we read it. We think that that's a promise that God has made to us as parents, that if we'll train up our child in the right way, that God will guarantee that when they get old, they won't depart from that way. I mean, that's what it sounds like, doesn't it? And when we look at it that way, here's the problem. Two things come to mind. Number one, if we raise up a child the best we can and they rebel against us and we rebel against God, then there's really only two conclusions we can make. Number one, I'm a horrible parent. And therefore, that's why my kids didn't turn out good. Or number two, the other possibility is that God didn't keep His promise. And frankly, both of those are problematic, aren't they? We don't want to believe either one of those things. I don't think we have to. I mean, first of all, we need to remember what the purpose of a biblical proverb is. Proverbs are not promises from God. What proverbs are, they're more of a general guideline for how things generally work in the world. They're not a guarantee by any means. I mean, I can demonstrate that real easily. Look at this proverb, Proverbs 14:23. In all toil there is profit, but mere talk tends only to poverty. So what that proverb's saying, if you work hard, you'll be okay financially. If you're lazy, you won't. I mean, that's the general principle. And generally, that works out most of the time in our culture. But I can guarantee you that every one of you in this room knows some exceptions to that particular truth, right? That's because the Proverbs were never intended by God to be a promise. They're intended to help us to live out our lives in a way that will honor and glorify God. So it gives us these general principles. So even if you look at Proverbs 22:6 and think it's this idea that if I train up my child right, he'll turn out to be a godly child down the road, then if that doesn't happen, it doesn't mean necessarily you're a bad parent. It doesn't mean that God broke His promise. It just means that you're one of those exceptions to the general rule, because there are exceptions to the general rule. But I'm going to suggest to you this morning that there's another way to look at that verse that actually does a much better job of taking away some of the guilt that we have as parents. And the added bonus is that it will also help us to understand what our child's greatest need is. It wasn't really till this week that I began to be exposed to this way of looking at this verse. And so at first I really kind of fought against it. But as I began to do some more research and some more study, I think there really is a different way to look at this verse. Let's look at it again. It says, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, the first thing we know that we need to see here is that in almost every English translation, I looked at all of them, and I think pretty much all of them have the word should in there, right? Most of you, even if you're using a different translation. That word is not in the Hebrew anywhere. It's not even hinted at by the grammar or the verb that's used there at all. I think it's one of those places where for some reason, the people who did the King James translation, they put the word should in there. And as all these other translations have come along, they didn't want to be too different from that, so they just kind of left it in. But it's not in there at all. The other thing is the word train, the verb there, the command. We have a certain idea about what that means. We've talked a lot about what it means for us the last couple of weeks when we've talked about discipline and instruction. But the word train that's used here, it really doesn't mean what we think about. It's a word that means to dedicate or to introduce or to inaugurate. There's only 3 other places, I think, in the Old Testament where that verb is used. And in all the other 3 places where it's used, it's translated dedicate. Because that's really the kind of the root meaning of that word. So if we were to more literally translate this verse, it might look something like this. Start out a child according to his own way. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now you see how this begins to say something a little bit different, doesn't it, than how we might traditionally look at that verse. An Old Testament professor named Richard Clifford, he wrote a commentary on Proverbs, and here is how he paraphrased the verse. He said this: "Let a boy do what he wants, and he'll grow up to be a self-willed adult incapable of change." Or we could go back even further to a Jewish philosopher from the medieval period, a guy named Ralbag, I can never remember his name, who translated it like this: "Train a child according to his evil inclinations, and he will continue in his evil way throughout his life." Now you see how that makes that verse completely different? What if that verse really isn't a promise that if we train our children right, that they'll follow God? What if it is instead a warning that says if we just leave our children to follow their own ways, that we can be pretty well assured that they'll stick to their own way when they become an adult? I think that's true. If you think about it, that is really more consistent with the Proverbs anyway. Think about the Proverbs. If you look at them in total, what they are is there are all these things about the fact that there are two paths or two ways in life. There's the way of life that's taken by the wise and the just and the godly. And there's the path of death that is taken by the foolish and the wicked and the lazy. And what's our natural tendency? Our natural tendency is to take the way of death, isn't it? Because as we're going to see this morning, our bent is to be lazy and to be wicked and to be evil. So the whole book of Proverbs, all these things that lay that out, and it warns us about taking that path. So there's all kinds of warnings in the Proverbs about not taking the path, not taking that way of death, and then providing us with some instructions about the antidote to that, which is to live according to the wisdom of the Scriptures. So if we look at this proverb like that, what we see is what it's really doing is warning us that if we don't raise our children according to the way of life, that they're going to follow their natural inclination and they're going to take the way of death in their lives. And I think that's true. We've seen that, haven't we already? Even in this series, even last week, we saw this inclination of our children to follow the way of death. We looked at this verse. It's another verse in the same chapter of Proverbs. We looked at it last week, Proverbs 22:15. "Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him." We looked at the last part of that verse last week, and the good thing about that is the last part of the verse gives us some hope. It says, yeah, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but there's a way to drive it out. If we will discipline our children, if we will teach them obedience to God's Word, if we will teach them godly discipline through the discipline that we put into their lives, that there is hope for them, that they won't follow that way of death. You know, most of us, we look at a newborn little baby and we say, oh, how sweet they are, how innocent they are. But let me ask those of you who are parents or have been parents, how many of you had to teach your child to lie? How many of you had to teach your children to be disrespectful? How many of you had to teach your children to say rude things to other people? Didn't have to do that, did they? They came up with that on their own. I don't think too many of you in here tried to actually instill that in your kids. I hope not. That's because our kids, they come into this world with this insatiable capacity to do evil. And you know where they get that from? They get it from you. They get it from their parents, who got it from their parents, who got it from their parents, who got it from their parents, all the way back to Adam. That's what we talked about last fall. Remember we were in Romans chapter 5. By the way, we'll get back to Romans again next week. But Romans chapter 5 was all about this idea that through Adam, all of us have this sin nature in our lives. We're born with it. It's not something that we have to learn because we inherit it. And even a guy like David, a man who the Bible calls a man after God's own heart, he understood that. He understood that from his very birth, that he had that sin nature. So he writes Psalm 51 and he writes this, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." What he's saying is that from the moment he was conceived, he had that iniquity, he had that evil bent within his heart. David wrote another psalm, Psalm 58, where he confirms that again. He says, "The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray from birth, speaking lies." And I think Solomon understood that when he wrote Proverbs 22:6. He understood the wicked heart of a child. And he says, if you just leave them to their own, they're going to keep on following after that. And they're going to stray away from God. See, a lot of times in the Proverbs, the way that a person follows that way of wickedness is just to do nothing. If we just allow our lives to go on without doing anything, that's our natural bent. He says the same thing is true when you're raising your children. If you just allow them to follow their own ways, guess what way they're going to go? So I think now we can answer that question that I posed earlier. From a biblical perspective, what is a child's greatest need? And because of the evil in their heart, we can answer the question like this. It's regeneration. That's what our children need more than anything else. The Bible tells us, it tells us that every single one of us, we were born in our trespasses and sin, and therefore because of that we were spiritually dead. And because we were spiritually dead, there was nothing that we could do to make ourselves alive again. And so we have to rely totally and completely upon Jesus Christ to do that in our lives. So Susan is right. What our children need is Jesus. They need to understand that they're sinners. And because of their sin, they've been separated from God. And that there needs to be a reconciliation there. A reconciliation that can come only through the blood of Jesus Christ. And that's not something, I wish we could, but that's not something we can do for our kids. We can't force them to do that. We can't coerce them to do that. But what we can do is we can apply all these things that we've been learning over the last 5 weeks in their lives with the idea that we can help lead them to learn what it's like to be a disciple of Jesus. In a sense, we're to do with our children exactly what we're to do in the rest of the world and follow the command that Jesus gave us to go and make disciples. That's what we're to do with our children. We're to make them into disciples of Jesus Christ. Now, in a lot of ways, that process isn't a whole lot different than the way we would do it with other people in the world. Obviously, we have to do it in a way that's age appropriate, a way that they can understand, and hopefully some of the things that we've talked about the last 5 weeks will help us do that. But the goal is to make disciples. And I wish I could get up here this morning and say, here's the 5 things that you can do, and it will automatically ensure that your kids will become disciples of Jesus Christ. I wish I could do that. But your kids are all different. And so what making disciples of your children is going to look like, it's going to be different for every home in here, and it's going to be different for every child, even within the same home. Just the same as it would be with anyone else. But I do want to make this as practical as possible. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow Paul's example. Remember Paul, we looked at Ephesians 6, chapter 4, and Paul says, he gave us a negative and a positive. He says, don't do this, don't provoke your children to anger, but do this, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So I'm going to start with the negative. Here's some approaches that don't work if we want to lead our children to experience that regeneration that they need. I'm going to share with you 3 of them, 3 approaches that don't work. The first one is this whole idea of self-esteem. There's this really popular approach in our culture today that just says we need to really make our kids feel good about themselves. I think probably the pinnacle of that was a Whitney Houston song that was popular back in the 1990s. The greatest love of all. Here's some of the lyrics from that song. I believe the children are our future. That's fine. Teach them well and let them lead the way. I'm fine with that. But here's the problem. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. Let the children's laughter remind us how we used to be. I found the greatest love of all inside of me. The greatest love of all is easy to achieve. Learning to love yourself, it is the greatest love of all. Now, there is an appropriate kind of self-love that the Bible teaches. We've talked about that the last few weeks in connections with the Louis Giglio videos. We sang about it this morning. What we sing? We sang, "Good, good Father, it's who you are and who am I? I'm loved by God." That's true. That's true. So there's an appropriate kind of self-love, but the kind of self-love and self-esteem I'm talking about is taken to a whole new extreme. I mean, think about it in our culture, these people that do everything they can to build up their child's self-esteem. So certainly you can't tell your child they did something wrong, heaven forbid, because that might hurt their little self-esteem. You want them to feel good about themselves, so certainly you don't want to discipline them or punish them for anything. And we see that all through our culture, don't we? I mean, see it in youth sports. This bugs the heck out of me, this everybody wins stuff. I mean, every kid gets a trophy. Every kid gets the same ribbon. It doesn't matter whether you worked hard so that you could excel or whether you just kind of came along for the ride. Everybody gets the same thing. Certainly see it in our schools. Certainly not all schools, but how many schools out there? They've developed grading systems so it's impossible for anyone to fail. Pretty much do all these group projects and everyone gets the same grade kind of thing. Schools that even now they have you're only supposed to use positive discipline on the kids. You can't tell them they did something wrong. That would ruin their poor self-esteem. I know when our kids were going to school, the latest fad at that time was inventive spelling. Because you didn't want to ruin the child's creativity by asking them to actually spell words correctly. I used some inventive spelling when I was in elementary school, and the teachers just marked it wrong. And it did not ruin my self-esteem for life. So what's happened is we've sacrificed hard work and discipline and excellence and self-control and good behavior all on this altar of self-esteem. And while that might seem kind of harmless, here's the problem. When we apply that, we never help our kids to understand what their hearts are really like. We tell them it's just okay to be who you are, and that's good enough for God. And that's not true. We've seen that this morning. So self-esteem doesn't work. There's a second approach that won't work, and that's behaviorism. And that's this idea that all we do is to focus on the external behavior of our kids. And I hope and I pray that I've made it really clear over the last 4 weeks when we've talked about discipline and about instruction that the whole goal of that is to focus on our child's heart. We've talked about you got to let the kids know why it's the heart problem behind the behavior that really needs to be addressed. We talked about some parenting styles, and we talked about the authoritarian parenting style. And believe me, if you want to get your kids to behave right, that's a great parenting style to use. Because your kids will be afraid of you. They'll be afraid of punishment. And so they'll behave, at least out in public. They'll be really polite to other people and respectful. But the problem is, when they leave home down the road and get out on their own, we found that they don't know how to deal with things. Because they never dealt with their heart. They only dealt with the externals. And we saw some of the results. There's higher incidences of things like suicide and substance abuse and things like that in those children. So you can make your children behave. But the problem is if you only make them behave on the outside without addressing the heart problem on the inside, they'll never again see their need for regeneration. Third approach that won't work, isolation. This one might surprise you a little bit. Here's what Paul wrote to the churches in Rome. He wrote, "I want you to be wise as to what is good and innocent to what is evil." And that's obviously a good thing to do. But here's what I think a lot of parents have done. In order to try to apply that in their homes, what they've done is they've kind of cocooned their kids. And they've isolated them from the world around them, or at least attempted to. And there's a lot in our culture, man, there's a lot in our culture that we do need to exercise some supervision over our kids. Man, there's stuff on TV and in movies and our music of the day and the internet that we do need. We can't just let our children take in all that stuff unsupervised. But on the other hand, we can't completely just isolate them from those things either. We need to help our children to become prudent, but not prudish. There's a difference there. See, I think prudishness and naivete, taken to an extreme, they actually set our children up for a huge fall down the road. Because they don't know how to deal with things when they get out of the home. I think a lot of the Proverbs, if you look in the ESV, it uses the term the simple. And I think that's what the writers of the Proverbs were dealing with. These people who didn't know anything about it. They were so innocent that they didn't understand there was evil out there in the world, and they didn't know how to deal with it. I think one of the reasons that a lot of parents resort to isolation is because, frankly, it's a lot easier than the alternative. It's a lot easier to just tell your kids, no, you cannot watch TV, you cannot go to movies, you cannot listen to secular music, than it is to actually take the time to sit down with them and watch a TV show and talk about the characters and how they either hold to biblical principles or how they violate those principles. Or to sit down with your kids and listen to some of the popular music in there and talk about what in there could pull them away from God and what kind of evil is being portrayed in all these places. It takes more time. But I'm convinced that the results are well worth it. I can tell you from my own personal observation, and I've seen this quite a bit, that the children who are isolated like that, they fall harder than almost any other kids that I've seen when they get out of the home. Because they've never been taught that there is evil out there. They've never been taught how to deal with that evil in a way that will honor God. And so when those temptations come along, a lot of times those kids, I believe, fall much harder than other kids. So we can't just isolate them. So if that doesn't work, then what does work? Here's what our children need to understand. I'm going to just share these with you pretty quickly. I'm not going to comment a whole lot on them. I've actually kind of adopted these a little bit, or adapted them a little bit from a book written by John MacArthur that's called What the Bible Says About Parenting. And if you want to I'd really suggest that as a tool. Everything in there is not perfect, but his section on the things your children need to understand is really good. So you can borrow my copy, you can go buy one, whatever. It's a great resource that I'd really encourage you to look at. But here's what our children need to understand. They need to understand, first of all, the holiness of God. They need to understand that God is 100% holy, and that because He's holy, He can't allow sin to fellowship with Him and to be permanently in His presence. The second thing they need to understand is their sinfulness. I've already talked about this a lot, so I won't belabor the point here. But your children need to understand that they are sinful, and they need to understand that their sin separates them from God. The third thing they need to understand is the person and the work of Jesus. Your child needs to understand that Jesus is God in the flesh, that He is God. That's important. They need to understand that God loved us so much that Jesus put on a body of flesh and came down here to earth. And that He lived a sinless life. And that He died on the cross to pay the penalty for our sins. And that He rose again to prove His mastery over death and over sin. So they need to understand the person and work of Jesus. They need to understand the need for faith in Jesus. They need to understand that they can't do anything themselves about their sin. That only God can do that for them. And that He's done that in the person of Jesus Christ. And that when they put their faith in Jesus Christ, that God looks at them and He sees the righteousness of Jesus in their life. Finally, they need to understand the cost of They need to understand that it means giving up control of their life and allowing Jesus to be in charge of their life. They need to understand that becoming a Christian doesn't make all their problems go away. The main thing to remember is that this is not something you do in a class one day in your home. This is a lifelong, full-time assignment that God has given to those of you who are parents, and He's given to us as a body of Christ. It's the most important responsibility that you have as a parent. And as we pointed out in this series, that means there's times of formal training when you're going to sit down with the Bible and you're going to explain these things, and there's a lot more probably times of informal training when you teach your kids how Jesus operates in the world around us. And guess what? That means the only way you can do that is you got to spend time with your family. That's how you spell, someone once said, how do you spell love? You spell it T-I-M-E in a lot of ways. You need to spend time with your family. And it's also important that you be thorough here. I think sometimes because we want so much for our kids to make that decision and pray that prayer, that we tend to abridge the gospel, that we tend to leave out some important parts because we're more concerned about them praying that prayer, making that decision, when what we really want them to do is to become disciples of Jesus. Jesus didn't say go and make converts. He didn't say go and make people who say a certain prayer. He said go and make disciples. And I don't know about you, but for me, that was a long process in my life. And the process of becoming a mature disciple is a lifelong process. None of us have gotten there yet. And so if that's true for us, just think that's also true for your kids. So don't be impatient, be thorough. Don't short circuit the gospel for the sake of getting them to make a decision. Obviously, we have to do this in a way that our kids can understand. And believe me, I know how hard that is. So it takes a lot of prayer for wisdom to understand exactly how to do that. I know that. See, nothing we can do as parents can guarantee that our children will grow up to be mature disciples of Jesus Christ. We can't believe for them. We can't coerce them. We can't manipulate them into the kingdom of God. But as we've seen this morning, we have this indispensable role in the life of our children to disciple them in order to help them to address their greatest need, the need for regeneration through faith in Jesus Christ. Here's what we do know for sure, however. If we abdicate that responsibility, if we just let our children live out their lives the way that they want, we can be pretty sure which way they're going to take later on in life. And so all the things that we've talked about these last 5 weeks really are summed up in the D that we've looked at this morning. As we delight in our children, as we devote them to God and devote ourselves to raising them up, as we discipline them, as we direct them, the goal is always to disciple them so that they can become mature followers of Jesus Christ. As we've seen over the last 5 weeks, as I mentioned at the beginning of this morning, that's not an easy thing to do, is it? So here's what I want to do as we close this series. We're going to spend some time just praying for our kids and praying for our parents. And so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just close your head, bow your eyes. You can do that silently. If God leads you, feel free to voice those prayers publicly. What did I say? Bow your eyes and close your head. Okay, bow your eyes and close your head, yeah? I want to see you guys do that. Maybe we'll try the other way. Bow your head, close your eyes. Does that work better? We want to pray. We want to pray for parents. So pray silently. If God leads you, go ahead and pray out loud if you'd like to. I'm just going to give us a few minutes to just lift up our children and our parents in prayer this morning.